And hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another session of Working in UX Design. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is Norman, and he's currently Senior Design Manager at Grab. And Norman is someone I've known for a couple of years, and he has joined Grab at a very pivotal point where Grab was growing at an accelerated pace. And today he actually drives strategy, design, culture, and growth across the organization, focus on elevating user experience, supporting the comms, the safety, the family experience for over 600 million users in Southeast Asia using the Grab app right now. So Norman is someone who's deeply fascinated by how business communities and ecosystems are built, broken, and evolve, and why we make the choices we do. And I can say after meeting him for a couple of times, he's generally a very curious person by nature. And today we are going to be asking him questions around his experience being a design leader, as well as managing in a very unique corporate environment where it's very fast growing, and how it sort of has evolved over the years, right? From being this very high growth startup to being more like an enterprise today. And we'll also get him to share a little bit more about developing talent, an area that he's very passionate about and interested in. And at the same time, how he himself develops as a design leader. So let's put our virtual hands together and welcome Norman to the show. Norman, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dalen. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So yeah, I just wanted to start off with a question. There's so much talk in town about AI. There's all this tech layoffs happening. Really wanted to quickly get your perspective on how that affects the career progress as a designer to a design leader. Yeah.
Great. So hard questions first. We can go for it. No, I think it's a great question, and it perhaps sets the kind of land right for us to discuss much more smaller microisms later on. So I think with that, with the state of design, there are many things. There's a state of design leadership per se. There's a state of design in itself, with evolution, not just with AI, but with all the tools, emerging tech that's shaping the future. If we start with the state of design leadership, what's interesting is if you think about many people on this call, and across Southeast Asia, many folks are actually the first or second generation product design leader. But it also means many people are the first product design, engineering, analytics engineer. And many of these folks are actually establishing not just teams, but they're establishing the operating philosophy for the first time, right? They are establishing kind of a longer term strategy. They're establishing setting qualities and standards. And a lot of these experiences aren't in place, all right? So we can't even say that they're mature or effective yet. They aren't in place. So a lot of this work is organizational design. And I think it's a really exciting time to think about these things as the world evolves. Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, lots of folks got let off within the last year. But I just want to balance the media, because the media loves to kind of amplify negative news, right? Let's be very clear, folks, like beyond tech itself, marketing and many other departments like us, folks got let go. So, and if you look at the data incrementally year on year, it's not as much as it was prior to 2019, right? So it's stabilizing right now. People are rehiring again. We fundamentally, in some of these kind of like larger tech organizations, we overhired, in short, right? And then with design, if we go a little bit into it, and I'm sure we can dive deeper. What's fascinating with AI, and not just kind of Gemini, Bard, and everything else, is the interface of the future is multimodal and ubiquitous. So the intriguing thing about this is the future of design isn't just in pages and pages of kind of like core UI flows. There's the possibility of us detecting whether you're on desktop or mobile in the future. Interfaces should be intelligent, contextual, and compiled in real time, possibly, based on context and relevance. Perhaps in the future, very soon, it can sense whether this context makes most sense in voice, touch, or typing. How does it switch those multimodal modalities based on what's natural for the user? So basically, in short, how do systems adapt to humans and not humans adapting to systems? Yeah, so that's kind of just to start it off.
Yeah. So if I were to ask, like, is there a future being a UX designer? What would you say?
I say yes. I say it'll be a really exciting future. And if I were to be more specific and helpful, I think lots of people tune into Figma Config, what was it, a month ago, and got both excited and very scared of what it could do. I think we look at that, it's just a couple of predictions. So I wouldn't say these are truths, right, folks? So one is the total number of Figma users globally is still quite low, right? Like Adobe users literally like, I don't know how many fold, but a lot more than us. So our world is a lot smaller than we think it is. And more than that, it's a great time to be a technologist, right? If you're 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 company, think of the kind of designer you should be for those organizations. Just think about that for a second, all right? And as you are with a thing like Figma, it's great. You should be excellent in your craft, but you should also be tool agnostic. So I'll say that again. You should be excellent in your craft, but you should be tool agnostic, right? For Figma to hit IPO, folks, which it wants to hit without Adobe, I would very clearly say its bigger audience that it wants to capture is non-designers. So it's going to go down the Canva route, right? And this means that we should start looking at our own organizations and thinking kind of other places, whether it's service design, whether it's strategy, whether it's kind of that interim between a technologist and a designer, to think how we contribute in new ways. And we've got a decent amount of time, I feel. So, really get stuck into your organizations, understand where they are in their journey of growth, evolution, and then think about how we can contribute meaningfully in these different ways.
Yeah, I think that's such a great answer, and I feel very relieved to hear that. Sorry. I think that's such a great answer, and I feel very relieved to hear that. And I'm just wondering, you're someone who's been a design leader for many number of years, and I'm sure you've evolved your style of leadership. As far as I'm aware as well, at Grab, there are actually two career paths for designers. One being more like a individual contributor specialist type of role where they become principal designers. And the other is kind of the track that you took on, which is more like a design manager. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on sort of segregating this kind of like two career development tracks? And would you consider even like the IC role a kind of leader? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think fundamentally, both the roles contribute in very different ways, both the IC and management track. And take note, like both of them are quite new, right, within organizations in itself. I think career compasses minus the Googles and the Facebooks are still being developed in many of these organizations. And with the IC, I think the best way to think about kind of these two dual roles is through a variety of factors, right? One is how do they contribute in a manner where it's true, its impact, its innovation, its kind of communication and its knowledge space. And when we say these kind of four paradigms, maybe it's in the aspect of craft, practice, process, and team, right? I think with IC, it's very clear that they lean into the craft. And into the craft, it's everything from obviously the visual, the interaction, the information architecture, the design systems, but technically how they paint the canvas for bridging the current state, the interim state, and the future state of the organization, right? And the ICs really look to galvanize people, to bring them on a journey on this beautiful evolution of what we're trying to build with products and services. And then with the management team, and I know this sounds a bit contradictory, but some parts of that bleed over with the ICs, because if you think about it, managers were previously ICs, right? Managers should actually have really good foundations of ICs, because it wouldn't be great if, yeah, it's kind of like a football coach not knowing the fundamentals of playing football. It's not a good fit, right? And I think with managers, we focus a lot more so on the practice as well as the processes and the teams, right? And what that means is within the practice, how are we helping the organization evolve? How are we helping them learn differently, right? Are we putting particular things in place? So when we hire people, what are the standards in which we hire them? When we set design reviews, can we work with the ICs to set different standards of quality, review, and excellence, actually, right? And with the managers, obviously, we look at careers. We look at the careers of the organization for design, and we look at how the organization evolves as a whole as well. So we spend a lot of time building and scaling teams and making sense and sense making with our design teams, but also with the larger organization of where we want to go. And through that process, hopefully what you get is a much more informed organization, one that is clear about, as I said earlier, its vision, its kind of mission, its philosophy, its longer term orientation, how it understands its problem spaces, how it invites people to shape those problem spaces, right? How it builds a dynamic team culture, and how do you as well coach and develop a solid bench and so forth, right? So yeah, it's a messy bit lah, but it's very fun and short.
Yeah, there are a lot of very interesting ideas that you covered as you were sharing from your experience leading at Grab. And I think I just want to maybe like double down and sort of like unpack some of these ideas. Let's talk bit by bit, right? Let's talk about the general process of building a team and hiring in general. So yeah, what's your take on that, or how has your perspective evolved over the years as a design leader on hiring?
Sure. So the question is hiring and building, right? Basically.
Yeah, hiring and building.
Cool. I always think that hiring is a privilege. I really, really do, especially when you can hire just beyond your own country. We live in a time where technically you couldn't, it was really hard to do that, say 15 years ago, globally, right? The way that our organizations were structured, budgets and everything. But now, I think when we talk about hiring, the first place that you should start before we actually talk about hiring is actually the team's operating philosophy. And I want to break that down a bit so it doesn't sound like jargon, right? So what that means in short is actually in the team that exists today, whether they're existing designers or they're no designers, what is the shared values, the culture, the expectations, the rituals, the practices of how we work today, in short, right? Because you're going to translate those things into a document which hopefully excites someone who's applying for clarity. And when you have a dialogue with people, they're naturally going to ask about these things, right? And as you do, there are questions about how you coach as well, because people ask that, if I get to work with you, Dalen, what kind of leader are you? You want to be able to articulate that very clearly, as opposed to kind of make it up on the go, right? The way in which we coach, is an evolving philosophy. Whether it's prescriptive and instructive, whether it's guided and directed, it evolves. So when you're hiring the team in itself, I feel it's great to think about where your team is today, as what I stated earlier. Is it 0 to 1? Is it 1 to 10? In its stage of growth, in its stage of its needs, in the stage of where it wants to go, where is it today? And you think about the talent in which would match that, in short. Part of that is leveling, part of that is skill set, expertise, knowledge, and so forth, right? Now, if you're lucky and you have been doing this for a while on your team, not just the design team, but the team itself, the department is a little bit more mature, and say maybe you're 10 to 100. So maybe your organization is profitable now, it's got a very different set of challenges, and it's thinking about the longer term future. Hopefully, you've got some good, solid designers in the bench, but you need to hire more. You should be thinking about how your future roles of designers coming in complements your current designers. So like what I shared earlier, right, about technologists. If you got 2 product designers today and you need to hire another 3 more, do you need an atypical product designer? Or actually, would there be value in thinking about how some of their roles evolve or complement each other? So take, for example, perhaps if you had a product designer, but they had a really strong passion for technology or service design or systems thinking. Each of these individuals coming in brings a completely new paradigm of thinking, learning, skill set that contributes to the team's evolution. Again, not just to the design team, but to the larger team itself. And I don't think most design managers think about it this way. They think about, what do I need now? Totally makes sense, because I need to fill in that gap and do the work. as opposed to this is what my team is today in 2024. What could it be a year from now? All right. How do I scaffold that actually in a Figma? If I use kind of just a sitemap, I go, these are all the problem spaces, these are all the designers. These individuals are doing really well. I could see them evolving both in scope, complexity, and other responsibilities a year from now, right? Could we draw that version? Great, here's another version of that a year from now. All right, so how about we do another version from that a year from now? And that intention here is to, one, visualize that, to have a discussion with your manager, because we'll all have managers, to manifest parts of that. Naturally, folks will leave sometimes the team. Actually, some folks will stay. I think it's in most managers' interest to try to keep their best folks in and that want to be there and engage them in a variety of different ways. And folks that aren't a good fit, well, that's a separate discussion altogether. Yeah.
I think I just want to make a sort of like an observation, and this is really nice that you're transitioning, talking about building capabilities, nurturing your team already as sort of like the next step. It looks like you are working backwards from the capabilities that you think would help solve your organization's challenge. That's something I observe from hearing you. And the second thing is also something that I observe from other design leaders as well, which is hiring for diversity. So not necessarily just hiring people who can only do digital UX design, but they have like a side interest in other things as well, whether it's service design, whether it's like systems, or whether it's like technology, and that makes the team stronger. It makes it more interesting, and I just want to point that out to everyone who's looking to switch and come into this industry. This is not just something Norman is doing, but I also observe quite a number of design leaders hiring like that as well. So that's really great. Just want to get a couple of your thoughts as you're moving on to the next stage of building a team. After building, it's like nurturing a team, right? So yeah, what are your how has your sort of like perspectives changed over the years on like nurturing teams, and growing teams, and yeah, evolving teams?
It's a great question. I think naturally, one of the easiest things to discuss is when the team starts scaling. So when when you start with 2 designers or 3, but then when it starts going to 10 or 11, the dynamics and many other things completely changes, right? And what was easy once just by me verbalizing to the 2 of us or the 3 of us now needs to perhaps be a little bit more formalized in documentation and habits, rituals, and formations. So that's one, right? The formalizing of that is really important, because as you hire more diversely, people who are from not just different backgrounds and expertise, you want to get everyone on the same wavelength. But the beautiful thing about doing that as well is that you look at some pretty standard basic practices like stand-ups, weekly design reviews, right? And you want the team to start challenging some of these kind of best practices to be better practices. And I'll use 2 examples. So I think the majority of us all here do stand-ups, and stand-ups is the kind of weekly ritual, usually on a Monday, where everyone shares what they're going to do for the week, right? And how they need help and whatnot. That's great. I feel that can be done via Slack, right? I have a motto, which is I like to start the week strong. I like to end the week positive, right? And what that means is when we start the week with, say, stand up on a weekly basis, the team doesn't share what their tasks are. They share what their goals are, right? And I'll be very definitive about the difference. So a task might be, hey, Dalen, I'm doing a workshop this week to brainstorm new ideas for a said and said feature. All right, that's a task. Great. You could tell us that on Slack, right? But if you share what your goal is, hey, Dalen, I'm actually kind of thinking about the longer term strategy for chat, and we're running a workshop in which we're bringing very different people together to have different perspectives and look at the business use cases for how people leverage that. Yeah, that's my goal for this week. Great. So what that does, not so much for me as your manager, but for the team, is the team starts learning each other's goals. And because I previously managed 4 different teams, they start learning more so about the goals than their tasks. and they can go, wow, that's really interesting. I've not done that before. Could I come and learn that from you actually? Or actually, I've done that before. And this was the template that I used for that kind of workshop, right? So the team starts understanding from macro level, actually how each of them are operating. And if there are difficulties, they can share notes with each other, right? So I think that's super helpful. And then another one is the design reviews. I think many of us sit in with the design reviews on a weekly basis, as we should. And the atypical design review is someone brings work. They've done a pretty good work of kind of, developing concepts for a particular experience, right? As they do, they provide context. What is the problem, right? Who are the users? What's the evidence in which we have this hypothesis or this point of view? Here are some concepts which I've developed, and let me show it to you. Let me walk you through it. That's kind of the atypical flow. Then everyone gives feedback. They just verbalize their feedback. So this is super small, but we started doing this maybe I think during COVID, about 3 years ago, and it's super effective. So when we move to feedback, Dalen, what we actually do from that part is we go into silent feedback. No one talks, right? We all just go either into Figma or the PowerPoint or whatever the document is. And for 15 minutes, we leave all our feedback there. So what that does is a couple of things. One is that it very clearly enables everyone to just leave whatever feedback that they want, but you'll very clearly see there's repetition. Some people are asking the same thing, right? Two is, if we're asking the same thing, maybe I'll just delete my comment because Dalen asked it already, it's there. I'll just +1, I'll heart it or something, right? But the more valuable thing is not so much that I can see each other's feedback, is this. If there's about 40 different feedbacks for your design, the person who's presenting, we pair that person with a moderator. The moderator's job, similar to affinity mapping, is to see the pattern in which what questions are being asked. Even though there are 40 questions, what are the most repetitive patterns that people are observing and asking? And when we go from silent feedback, which was 15 minutes of silence, into live feedback again, right? The moderator helps the presenter to go, okay, hey, actually, we've got lots of feedback. Instead of addressing every single one, which is super not helpful, I see patterns here in these 4 different places. So the designers start co-coaching each other. They start co-facilitating a design review process. It becomes a lot more streamlined in articulation. The designer who's presenting walks away with guided, directed areas of focus or feedback versus just burst of verbal diarrhea, right? Everyone just giving their points of view. And what that does is that it makes for a much more richer conversation of learning, growth, and roles get reversed. In the future, the person who's presenting will become the moderator for someone else, right? So the literacy, the skills, the expertise, the knowledge is a lot richer. You're helping the team evolve a very different set of skills, not just presenting, right? But facilitating in a very different role in which you're elevating the quality of feedback and quality of design, hopefully, as well. Yeah, hope those
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to run feedback sessions. I'm just wondering what's the role of, say, the manager in this process then? Yeah.
The manager's role in this is to hopefully lead from the back. One is to give people space, right, to participate in this and to look for elements where one is the quality of the work at the level where it should be, right? And I'll be more specific because I think some of this is very abstract. If a person is bringing a project and it's diverging in double diamond, right? So that in the very initial onset, the person is exploring as much concepts as they are. My brain is wired in a manner where I'm looking at the work that perhaps Natalia is doing, and I'll go, has she explored and exhausted all avenues of concepts of what she could achieve? Or has she not actually? And is the way that the team is thinking about giving her feedback framed around that? Or is someone else like Irene over-indexing too much on, like an interaction component or whatnot? And that's not the intent of the feedback, right? The intent of the feedback for this particular session, not that interaction doesn't matter, is focus on divergence, not convergence, right? If it's about convergence, where it's really, really about the detail, everything from the user experience, the core flows, is it built in the best way? Are we leveraging the design system and so forth? That's a very different kind of feedback as well. So my role is to look at that from macro level and connect the dots to go, this is fantastic. Just take note, within Grab, we've got 30 different teams. Have we had conversations with some of those people, right? If not, let's consider that so that our work is more integrated and holistic as a whole.
It sounds a little bit like being a coach, a mentor, and maybe a connector. Would that be an accurate description?
Yeah, indeed. And indirectly, you're trying to, you might not do this in the review session. You might do it after. You're trying to help the designers build their point of view. So sometimes when someone gives a feedback or when someone asks a question, it's not fully articulated in the most clear or precise way. And I'm not talking about like the use of language, but I mean the articulation, the clarity of thought. Do I need to tell that person right then? Most likely not. But I could tell the person later, maybe in our next one-on-one, so that they can be more effective. They can contribute more effectively, right? That's one. And two, also, it again raises the level of overall discussion in how we review the work.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about building teams. We talked a little bit about nurturing teams. Now let's talk about going to the next generation, having your team members sort of like succeeding and going on autopilot or whatever that means. Yeah, how has your perspective evolved on leadership succession or like succession in general?
Wow, just thinking how I should approach that. I'm thinking, but I'll talk about it from a perspective of building the senior ICs within my team and how that journey has been. And I think that might interest people here as well, potentially. And if I'm going off tangent, just let me know, Dalen.
No, I think we're very much on track.
Cool. So I think how it's changed is historically, even prior to Grab, I would lean on the organization to give me guidance, direction, templates, practices, processes on how I should be coaching someone. I think this was years ago, right? Maybe like 8, 9 years ago when I was just getting into the management track. And I found a lot of it insufficient, right? And not because it wasn't detailed or specific, but because by coaching someone, each individual is different. Of course, you should have a framework in practice. So let's ground it in kind of an understanding, right? Which is someone joins the organization. After they pass probation, so whether that's 3 to 6 months, you would have seen their progress, their contributions at a particular level. You should be combing feedback from their peers and partners, meaning the PMs, engineers, and everybody else, on how they're performing and contributing to the team. You would have your own point of view as well, right? And from that, you should be starting to develop a development plan for them. This development plan should be co-created together as a whole. And what this does is, as you have this development plan for them, firstly, they should be aware of it because they're going to contribute to it, right? They should be aware of it because perhaps within your organization, you might practice 360s, in which every 6 months, people give feedback to each other, right? But fundamentally, a development plan or a 360 plan should be a forum in which you give feedback, but you would have given that feedback multiple times throughout the 6 months. As a person is performing really, really well, you want to be clear about how they can get to the next level. So from the development plan that showcases that they are solid, the stretch goals plan, which shows aspects of their readiness for the next level, is co-authored by you, meaning the manager. And it clearly demarcates the behaviors, the actions, and the role model characteristics that prescribes to perhaps a principal designer, right? And that way, as you share this with the designer, you can have a discussion to say, I think you show good readiness. From a time box perspective, it cannot be promised, but from a readiness perspective, we could look at potentially the next 12 months to 18 months, right? And as the person's making good progress, let them know. As the person's not, let them know as well, all right? And what this does is that it clearly demarcates through the stretch goal. These are all the things that we can do, not just through a checklist factor, but kind of the behaviors, the actions, and the role model and characteristics to help you get to the next level. I always feel if you're a designer within an organization, you're most likely contributing to the work, meaning you're doing great work by building products and services, and you're contributing to the team, perhaps the team culture. You're empowering the team, right? Up-leveling the team's knowledge about the value and the contributions of design. But as you evolve, if your organization's a bit larger, you are doing many other things. you're trying to influence, you're trying to inspire, you're trying to bring others beyond your team along on a journey, right? And to folks who are not used to doing that, you need to demonstrate and guide them through that process. You're also trying to help the designer build upon a view of how they might want to help the organization evolve. Maybe for someone, they might be a technologist, and for fun, they build Figma plugins, right? In which we can automate lots of processes to make sure that actually we save money, designers are focused on more important things, and overall their value is evolving as a whole. So I think it's really important to help designers with the career development in terms of a development plan and stretch goals, but also equally important for them to build an identity and point of view and kind of their voice as they evolve.
Yeah. I'd like to really elaborate on this thing you just said, because you mentioned point of view several times. The way I interpret it, it sounds like how they value add to the organization, but I kind of feel like there's more to it than that. Yeah. So could you elaborate? What do you mean by point of view?
Sure, of course. Let me think of an example through an individual. Okay, great. So as shared earlier, through a point of view, take, for example, a person is a service designer, is a product designer, but they have service design skill sets, or they're interested within that paradigm, right? And there aren't many types of individuals within the organization that are like that. So you might go, how do you value add through that process? A lot of what we're doing today is digital, as what Dalen said earlier, but how do we contribute beyond digital? Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that? Okay, well, if you look at the future of AI, a huge part of that is conversational design. And actually, prior to AI, a lot of it was exploratory, also through conversational design, right? That existed before AI, just to be clear. So that service designer might go, okay, yes, I can obviously build a chatbot. I can build a chat experience through support chat, right? But how might I go about doing that? Could I build a chat experience where we build something that's universal for the organization, that isn't just for support, but for the whole organization? And as we do this, we set a series of guiding principles and standards, whether it's for content, whether it's personas in which the chat bot assesses the type of issue that you're resolving, right? And there could be different levels of severity in issues. It could be FAQ versus something that can be self-serve versus something that needs to be spoken to an agent. And through that whole process, maybe you create a playbook, right? You create a playbook, but you create a process, a guidance and governance through that playbook, in which we build chatbots, we scale it through the organization, and we take learnings from the best agents, Alan, for example, the best human agents, look at why are they thriving, what are they doing that is really sophisticated, patient, and thoughtful, and take some of those qualities and embed it within the chatbot, right? And as the chatbot is doing well, how can we take some of these qualities and potentially cross-pollinate and share with the agents? So it's this kind of like evolving wheel in which it gets better, hopefully, over time. That's a very unique point of view. Great. Show me how you can do that. Demonstrate that to me, right? And I watched the designer, which I coached ages ago, do this. She did an amazing job on it. Her name's Sujong, and she's now at Revolut. So helping each of you designers to identify the area, the space in which they want to play. Because if it comes top down from me, they're not going to enjoy the experience, primarily because they don't really care about it in the same way that I do, right? It's very request orientated. It's very prescriptive and instructive. Whereas actually to get to the next level, you're seeking less affirmation from your manager and really more co-creation, co-partnership, more soundboarding actually, right? And that itself is interesting because then perhaps you lean on me less for recommendations, but more for really kind of rethinking and reimagining things as a sounding board. So that's just an example.
Norman, thank you for elaborating with that example and giving it and describing it in such a concrete way. As a follow-up question, I'm just wondering, is this like just a side project? Is this like their 20% time? Or how are designers supposed to, I guess you could say, tinker do all these exploratory projects while also doing delivery? Yeah, I'm just very curious how that is executed.
That's a very, I love that question because it's very pragmatic, right? No, I mean, generally it's very pragmatic. So within the teams that operate, we do this thing called capacity planning. I don't think it's unique, but I just need to kind of state what it is, and it's a very helpful tool to answer what Dalen's asking. Right? So with capacity planning, what it is every quarter we do a 12-week planning ahead, which is not unique. And naturally, we talk to our partners, we talk about what critical initiatives we need to work on, whether it's kind of P0, P1, P2 priority, right? And then we assess what the problem is, what the impact is, and how much investment we need in terms of capacity planning, how many weeks and so forth, right? And we obviously go about it a variety of different ways. In that 12 weeks, I share with the designers that one, they own their time, right? My role is to look at that capacity planning, look at the initiatives that are there and advise them and challenge and question them that whether it's the best and most well-intentioned series of initiatives that they're working on, not just for themselves, but for the organization, right? Is what they're working on connected to the larger tech priorities, organizational goals? So that's one. Answering your question, we identify together, not just me, we identify together projects that are valuable for the organization. So that project that I mentioned earlier, I can mention it now. Grab was moving towards an automation strategy. Right, this was like, I think in 2019 to 2021. So part of the process, we were designing or exploring chatbots. But the way that we articulated and thought about it could have been so much better through a service-first mindset. And this is where Sujong really thrived, right? It wasn't just improving the overall UI and overall the call flows and how we serve people, but it's completely rethinking actually how do we connect the best of human agents with something that is not human. And let's not pretend for it to be human. So what we do is we try to allocate a good 20 to 30% every single quarter to projects that are like this, that are kind of innovative and thoughtful. And we don't get the permission of our cross-functional partners, just to be clear. We let them know what these things are, and we involve them in the process. And it's much easier through that process of owning your time, because every single quarter, you'll have high priority initiatives. You'll have BAU things or things that fall through and everyone needs to follow up. But then you also have a certain percentage which you'll dedicate to doing things that are exploratory, right? But you need to help the team to build the conviction and understanding and clarity of why this is valuable, right? From a strategic perspective, not just from a visual design perspective. So that's where we help the team to articulate that and to build a point of view through documentation, but also then through the design development process.
Yeah, thank you for elaborating on that. And as a general follow-up, you've really articulated like the way you run things at Grab, and it almost sounds like you could write a textbook about this. I'm not sure, maybe at some point you will. And I'm just wondering, like especially many of us might be very new managers in this process. What kind of competencies should I look at building first? Maybe I've been great at my craft, then I'm recognized for my craft and my, general attitude, and now I'm asked to build a team, and grow a team and lead a team. Yeah, how do I get to where you are? Like, what kind of competencies should I be building? Yeah.
Do you mean on the design management part, or do you mean on the IC path?
I would say design management. Yeah, because you've articulated many of these things, and I don't think it comes naturally to designers to just like point out like, hey, you're missing over here. Yeah.
So if I were to kind of just restate the question back to you, it's more of like, how do you evolve your design management practice in time?
Yeah, you could say so. Yeah, like how do you grow into that role?
It's a great question. Let me just think about this. I think with design management, first of all, management as a whole is not new, right? There's so much management understanding and practice throughout the world, whether it's in management consulting, whether it's sports management, and so forth. So there are lots of references, and I am a voracious kind of reader and learner. I spend a lot of time watching sports. I think sports are deeply fascinating, and I think, sorry, the thing that I'm trying to underline and get to, not sound too waffly, is when you're building your management practice, technically you're not doing it alone, right? You've got the head of product that's there, or a senior product person. You've got a senior engineering person. They are also doing it. They might be at the same level as you are in terms of where you are within your career as a new manager, if you are. And it's good to share notes, right? You'll be super relieved that not everyone has their shit together. And I don't mean that from a rude way. I just mean we're all co-learning together. So what I find super helpful early on in my career is co-coaching and co-learning together as managers. Sharing your notes, like what are you doing actually within your team, right? What are the habits, rituals, and practices and activities that you're doing to keep your team engaged? Oh, what am I doing? What is that person doing? And you might be functionally different, but there are things that you can learn from each other, right? There's rigor, there's discipline, there's many aspects of standards and of expectation. I've learned so much from my engineering counterparts as well as my product leaders. I think even more so than design management, honestly speaking. And I found that super helpful as I was growing and evolving. Two, as you're doing that, I find it super helpful, and I think this is, I guess, related to being kind of an organization leader, to build an informal advisory or co-coaching board. So, if you look at your phone right now, folks, are there 5 or 6 people you can talk to very intimately that perhaps are not within your organization to learn about particular things of how you're hiring, building, evolving your teams? And they don't need to be managers per se, and they don't need to be design per se. They could be in different industries, right? Someone could be 60 years old, but they've lived a very rich life as an entrepreneur, right? And you can pick their brain. Do you have that actually? And what that does is that enables you to learn from very different people, but very different standards and points of view. It doesn't mean that you need to take everything that you hear and practice it, but it's to discern, right? This might have worked with this individual during this time, but I'm at a very, as you said, early part of my career, and my organization is much smaller. What do they need? What does my organization need? And that through that process, like all things, you have to experiment, right? So there's a lot of trial and error. You might make a bad hire, own that, right? Own that and learn from that actually, right? You might make a really good hire. Great. How do you keep that person engaged? That person is motivated beyond just money and more work. They're motivated perhaps by something else outside. How do I think of and approach that? And as you go through these intricacies, these very beautiful kind of explorations with people, really share this knowledge with other people and vice versa. I think that's really the best way in which I learned. Of course, there are books in which you can learn as well, which I'm happy to share later.
Yeah, I think sure everyone will be interested in your reading list, and feel free to share it on your LinkedIn. I think everyone will give you a follow after this. We got a couple of questions coming in, and I'll just direct you to the right ones. And as a follow-on question to what you just shared, it sounds like, hey, I need to read up, I need to have this advisory board, and I can practice with my peers. Just wondering, like, if you're doing all of that, like, while you're also being expected to be good at your technical craft, how do you balance that? So that's one of the questions from the audience.
Got it. But I'm a manager, so I would do both. I think if you're talking about managing my technical craft, meaning how do I still make sure my knowledge
technical
is deep?
skills. Yeah, your technical skills sharp while you're absorbing as much as possible all this new information from being a good design manager.
Making sure you still practice parts of it. I mean, that's the honest truth, right? It would be crazy if I did not know how to use Figma at all, and not just knowing how to use the tool in itself, but understanding the most kind of like recent up-to-date innovations and evolutions of it. And more than that, beyond that tool per se, there are many other tools. So in the age of AI, how are we all, on a daily basis, just reading trialing, experimenting with these tools. And we don't need to be deep experts in them. But I think the great thing about having good enough knowledge, if not expert level, is seeing the potential of what they can do. And then bridging the gap for your teams. And it doesn't need to be for a designer. It could be for an engineer, for them to further explore that and see how they could potentially use it or build it in-house or whatnot, right? So it's a balance, but I don't think for managers we're ever expected to go deep within the toolkit in itself. Just being transparent. Yeah,
that's well understood, and thank you for sharing how you strike that balance. There seems to be a lot of freedom that you're afforded as a design manager, almost in the way that you run things. How did you get buy-in? Someone asked, how did you get buy-in from your senior managers to run it the way you run it, as you describe it to us? Yeah.
It's an interesting question because I don't think I got buy-in to do it the way that I wanted. I think the honest truth, Sylvan, I think I saw you answer, you asked that question, right, was my manager's managing 8 teams. He's got other things to worry about, right? I'm managing 2 or 3 or whatever number it is, or 4 now. So what's most critical in our relationship, if I focus on that part, right, is more of how do I manage my manager, right? How do I manage up, per se? And that's an interesting one. And what I do through that is, as I shared earlier, when I had this new manager more recently, Stevanos, who's fantastic, right? From the get-go, very early on, we spoke about how we wanted the team to operate. So he was my sounding board, right? And we spoke about those initial operating philosophy that I shared earlier, shared values, culture, expectations, and everything else. And he would give me feedback on that. So there is a kind of relation that's happening there. And then as I speak to him on a weekly basis, whether async or in person, if it's async, I provide him weekly updates on goals, learnings, and critical things to note or support. So that when we do meet in person, we spend a lot of time discussing those things, discussing current, future needs, state of teams, craft, practice, innovation, right? And then be very clear about where I'm seeking guidance on, be very clear on what my personal growth areas are in which he's recommending, but where I would like to also develop skill sets on, and how he might help me as a manager. And what that does is that, one, it sets me up for success, but it also sets him up for success. He's not blindsided with the things that I'm doing or not doing, right? And 2 is, as I'm doing these things, I learn what is most difficult for my manager. What is he struggling with, and how can I support that? And I think managers as a whole appreciate that.
Yeah. That sounds very self-directed and also very enlightened in the way both of you interact. I think we got a general question, and I'm not sure if this is something you could answer. So someone called Natalia mentioned that she recently switched to UX design, originally from Russia. Yeah, what's the local context over here for UX design? Would you say, is it done any differently? Because from what I understand, Grab is a pretty international organization with very, very diverse teams, although it's not very representative of the general state of UX in Singapore. Yeah, I'm just wondering, referring back to your what you said previously, yeah, how would you compare, right? Like this being, I know you were previously in MSD, so that might have been quite a different culture, more like business driven type of culture. Yeah.
Sure. Natalia, if you're there, do you want to be more specific so that Dalen and I can be helpful as well? Because I do want to answer your question. I just want to make sure it's,
100%.
yeah, it's what.
Hi, can you hear
it.
me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry,
Yes,
a bit
go
noisy
ahead.
here. Actually, what I meant is I want to understand that, like, for Grab is a very like I mean, if we take the context of Singapore, how Grab operates in Singapore, that type of like approach, is that different from the UX perspective compared to international practices? I guess that's what I meant.
Got it. The short answer is I don't know, Natalia, right? I worked in Thailand, Singapore, and Brazil, and I haven't worked in those 2 other places long enough to give you a good assessment. So I don't want to give you a false answer. What I will say in the standards and quality of the practice, if that's what you're asking, is Patrick Jean, who's our global head of design, went to config Figma 2 months ago in San Francisco. And what he shared back, trying to think about what I can share openly, right, in public. What he shared back was, one, he was really, very surprised and very happy that lots of folks in the Bay Area have heard of us and heard of and seen our work and the standards in which we've reached, right? And not just what you see in the app itself, but in exchanges behind the doors of career ladders and everything else as well. So Grab's really reaching a level where everything from our design system to career ladders to the quality of our work, the way that we're operating more as an empowered team model. We're not just people who execute upon work, we participate. And I mean the designers, Natalia. Designers participate in empowering the team, in shaping the strategy, and shaping kind of the online, offline experiences is, to me at least, at a really, really good international level. But do I know that in depth? No, that's the honest truth as well. That's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I would like to share, I don't think Natalia asked this, but I would like to share kind of a expanded point of view on that. So what I shared way earlier, Natalia, is design leadership as a whole within Southeast Asia is first or second generation. But what's interesting is if you read the news, lots of design leaders in the West, if you want to focus in that area there, are starting to look at aspects of fractional, right? Are starting to look at aspects of venture building and being an investor. Not everybody wants to be head of design or chief, design officer within the organization. Those are a very different set of responsibilities. So people like Julie Zhao, who I think some folks here know, or Angel Sturger, who was a VP at Facebook of design, fantastic designer, have kind of broke out, started their own shop, invested in small startups, but also advise, right? And I think this is actually really, really interesting. I would love to see more design leaders in Southeast Asia contribute in a different manner in this way and beyond.
Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that. And hope you got a satisfactory answer, Natalia. And we got a couple of questions to cover, and this one's a very common challenge in Asia that I observe while coaching clients as well. Could you share some tips about how one can grow a team in a non-UX mature organization or non-design focused organization in general, from a ground up level?
Yep, I can. I think when your organization is not as mature and so I'm just trying to check who asked this question. Was it Jane?
Yeah, that was Jane. Yeah, that's right.
I think if you're trying to influence and get buy-in or just partnership with cross-functional leaders, Jane, and not just the team itself, one of the fundamental things to really, really do is understand the difference between values, what I care about, what Dalen cares about, what you care about, Jane, versus value, how I demonstrate impact, right? Most times when people meet each other, they're very good at talking about the latter. How do we drive more impact, right? How do we get more revenue, right? And so forth. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about what I care about. And why that's so critical is because it helps you get an assessment of how the person understands design, right? The value of it, the way it works, the way it can be wielded. And from that understanding, you can have a really rich conversation to talk about how in time you involve them in the process of understanding their value. And through that process, you're sharing observations on the team. You're discussing how the team can operate better, even if the team is small, right? Show better judgment, take more intelligent risk, and so forth. And you want to align on these values, what we care about together. So what that does is that you get really good partnership, but potentially as well, longer term, executive sponsorship. Someone who wants to make something happen and they believe that actually design is a great lever to help drive that. So that process of really understanding the context of where each other are coming from and why that's important is a great place to start, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would sort of just ask a question, but instead of just answering it directly, I thought of maybe encouraging you to share a story, Norman, So I recall you had this story that you shared with me over dinner about how you won over a very difficult stakeholder, especially after encountering like some conflict with this stakeholder, and eventually this stakeholder became like a champion for your team's work. So yeah, I'm just wondering, as you're encountering conflict or as you're encountering friction, doing your work as a design manager, yeah, could you share that story, how you resolved it?
Sure. I'm just trying to think which was this because there's so many. But no, I'm joking.
Yeah, whatever comes to mind.
Sure. I think a huge part of the design process is really about understanding people as a whole. It can't be understated because whether you're a new junior designer or whether you are in your 50s later on, you'll always be working with people. So I think the criticality of understanding how to work with people is very important. And when you come across a person who just perhaps has a very different point of view from you in the world, it's a great challenge. And I mean that in a whole variety of different ways. It's a great challenge for you where it's a learnable moment, right? And in this case, for example, what Dalen was kind of persuading me to share, with an individual who perhaps isn't sold or bought into the value of design, a huge part of that is helping them bridge that gap. There's no secret to that, you know. And through that whole process, you're doing a whole variety of things. You're trying to, one, really show and share a common language, right? What are these things that we care about? How can it be broken down and executed in a manner that is palatable? You're trying to tell a compelling story to bring people along. And most times I would say, show, don't just tell. That's the beauty of design, right? We can visualize a whole envisioning process or an improved process to help someone understand. And one of the things that I think brings people along the journey is when you get them in the same room with customers. It's a very humbling thing because it's less about us versus them via function, but more about actually what's our hypothesis as a team collectively together? Why do we believe those things? Okay, we have differing views, meaning me and Dalen, because we're from different functions. Great. Could we test that as we talk to this focus group? And we're not seeking truths per se, we're seeking perspectives, right? Because what someone says within Indonesia versus Malaysia versus Thailand could be different because of context. So they're not truths, they're perspectives. I just want to state that very clearly. And as they do that, one is sometimes that person has never been invited to a room to hear customers speak and to see the emotional toll or confusion that a person has with respect to what you're showing them. Most customers don't wake up and care about what we're building for them. Right, honestly speaking, they go about their lives and they have other considerations into play. Well, one very small, minor fraction of their big magnitude of their life. So I think we need to kind of remember that. Two is as we bring them through that process, kind of unveil the curtain and show them behind how it's made, in short. So how do we take those insights and learnings from great user research and turn them into particular actions, experience actions, not just design? I find it super helpful when you talk about design without ever saying the D word, right? I don't know any other function that spends so much time trying to promote itself about talking about itself. And I almost never do that within the rooms that I've been in. So I find it really helpful when you talk about it from experience perspective, because an experience could be operational. An experience could be digital. Design is there, but you don't need to mention it per se, you know? And as you do that, you're taking different types of data points and evidence, perhaps evidence is a better word, to really showcase and re-inform why the particular concept that you're developing is the way that it is. And there's an element where, as you're developing that, you're experimenting with it. You can potentially A/B test it, but you need to have a strong point of view. You shouldn't just give in. And that strong point of view should be driven by evidence, logic, and reasoning, not just by design. I cannot say that enough. Because what you're trying to do is balance aspiration with pragmatism, speed with precision, right? And it's tough, but as you're doing that, this person needs to come along on that journey as well. I think that's the best way to summarize it, you know, because fundamentally what you want and what the person want in terms of value and values in some ways interconnected.
Yeah, I got so much sound bites. I think our social media person is going to have a field day, like extracting thoughts from this particular video. As a last question, I just want to ask you. You know, you started your path as being a design manager roughly about 8 years ago. Now, if you were to turn back time, right now, being the wiser Norman, right? If you turn back time, go back and give yourself some advice, what would that be, right? To a new Norman being a new design manager. Yeah.
Wow. Where does one start?
Just a couple of top things I think would be more than suffice, right? Because I think being a manager, as you said, we're all just also figuring it out as we go along. So yeah, maybe just a couple of the first few things that you wish you knew as you started.
I think one is management is almost somewhat sometimes a thankless journey, because you're no longer an IC. You're not front and center kind of shining, right? Yes, you're leading from the back. You're not leading from the front, as I would say. So your role is from a coach perspective. And the coach is working, if you look at a sports team, it's working with the nutritionist, right? It's working with the data scientist. It's working with all these other people to make sure the team on the field is at its best. So I think what I would, I guess, advise myself is, one, look at it from that lens, but longer term, and be more patient with myself, in short. I think I was in a hurry to up-level myself really quickly with particular kind of like approaches and tricks and practices, that some of it is just, it's a passage of time. It's a rite of passage, if you will. So you'll get the chance to build your first team. You'll get your chance to build your second team, your third team, your fourth team. Each team is technically an iteration of the previous team, but hopefully better. More hopeful, more optimistic, more ambitious, but more just like good, you know, as human beings, not just as designers. And maybe with my first generation of designers, I wish I was better for them because I was inexperienced, you know. So my point of view wasn't as strong because I didn't have operating philosophy, just being very transparent, right? I was still developing my practice as a whole, and being more patient and measured with my decision making would have been really helpful. Two, I think, in terms of kind of just really looking at the management practice, I leaned a lot into my strategic thinking, which is my core strength, right? And I continue to lean into it. But the feedback that I got early on within my career was, you lean so far into it that you're ignoring parts of the craft. And that doesn't mean that I didn't know the tools and I didn't understand how to design, but that I was sometimes perhaps siding too much with the product leaders and engineering leaders than I was with where design wanted to go, right? Because I, at that time, valued longer term thinking over product quality because it's more 0 to 1. But you can do both. But you can only do both when you have more knowledge over time and more experience, you see. So for that, I think it's interrelated to the first issue that I had. I was not patient, you know. I wanted results, basically.
It sounds like you've also grown a lot kinder to yourself, and are less anxious in chasing or even like trying to drive a particular outcome, which I think it's great. And what I really learned from hearing you share this retrospective about yourself is how you've evolved as a leader, how you start to think a little bit more long term, and how you just come to be, right? And just giving things time, just giving things time to develop, and just dropping so much wisdom in this process. So as a sort of like as an end, what are you going to do with all this sharing? I mean, I think you've shared a lot in the last hour, and I'm going to wrap it up. But yeah, what are you looking to do with all this knowledge and operating philosophy on design management that you've acquired? What's next for you?
Cool. What's next for me is I am leaving Grab by the end of this month. So folks that don't know, I am. After 5.5 years, I'm excited to kind of just look at the next chapter. I think where Dalen's pushing me, and he's very kind, because when we last met up, he asked me what I was doing next, was the following, right? So I am going to venture building. I'm working with a series of kind of smaller early stage startups to advise and guide them through the 0 to 1, 0 to 10 process. That to me is a very different kind of role altogether, right? That's really exciting. And then another part which might interest some of you or other folks here is I'm going to develop a curriculum around design management and leadership, where I'll actually look at some of these things that I spoke about. And instead of it just being abstract, really like create a whole series of practices, frameworks, tactics that people could use within their organizations, right? And create a coaching practice around that. So I'm looking to kind of establish that maybe in October, November, later this year as an experiment, and it's cohort based throughout Southeast Asia. So it's to bring people together, whether it's new managers or more seasoned managers, to share different stories, point of views, practices, and hopefully let it evolve. And then I'll be sharing this online as well on LinkedIn and other forums. So lots of learning.
That's excellent. That's excellent. So if you like to find out more and kind of follow through with Norman's work in design management, do give him a follow on LinkedIn. I'd like to first thank you for dropping so much wisdom tonight, and also sharing and answering quite a number of questions that we have from our audience. And I hope that this was satisfactory. And if you like Norman to elaborate more, do reach out to him and find out more. And with that, thank you so much for being a listener today and coming to this session. I hope you gained something out of it. Do share, do like, do subscribe, and do also synthesize what you learned from Norman today and share it on your socials, and feel free to tag Curious Core and Norman on LinkedIn. I'm sure we'll be very delighted to hear what you learned. And with that, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, and Norman, any last words?
No, it's great. This is fantastic. I always enjoy our sessions, Dalen. So thank you. Thanks, folks. Appreciate you as well for tuning in. Have a good one. Peace.
Awesome. Thank you.